This video introduces the most important musicians and hits of early rock and roll, as well as discussing its defining musical features. Rock and roll is a popular genre of the 1950s that combines the music forms and lyrics of rhythm and blues and country music with a backbeat and electronic instruments and recording techniques. A backbeat is an emphasis on the offbeats of a dual meter. Much early rock and roll is in what we call 4/4 time, having 4 beats to each measure or bar. That's duple meter. We would expect the most important beats of the measure to be on beat 1 and then followed by beat 3. Indeed, the most important words of most rock and roll hits do land on these 2 beats, 1 and 3. The bass drum, however, will generally strongly emphasize beats 2 and 4, creating the backbeat. The faster examples of early rock and roll, especially those with clear influences of country music, are sometimes referred to as rockabilly. Although the performing forces of rock music have changed many times since the early rock and roll of the 1950s, you might, in general, expect to find the layers outlined on your screen. Most rock features a lead singer, sometimes with backup singers. You might hear short instrumental solos and call and response with these vocals. Some rock songs have bridge passages that are entirely instrumental with no singing. These solos might be played by the guitar or electric bass, by the keyboard, or even by the drums. Depending on the type of rock, you might hear other accompanying layers of instruments, from horns and flutes to strings. The rhythm section, which might be as simple as a drum set and bass, or more elaborately include keyboards and a variety of string and percussion instruments, provides the rhythmic foundation. You see in front of you the different components of a standard drum set. At the bottom of the screen lies the musical notation of a standard rhythmic repeated pattern or ostinato found in rock music. The notes that have the X's indicate the hi-hat or the ride cymbals subdivision of the beat. Other members of the rhythm section can include the electric bass and rhythm guitar. The bass, to the bottom of your screen, looks a lot like an electric guitar, except that it has only 4 strings, whereas the electric guitar has 6 strings like your acoustic or classical guitar. The same types of guitars can be used to play both lead guitar and rhythm guitar. The distinction comes from how the musical layers function in a rock band texture rather than from any difference in the physical construction of the performing force. You've already been introduced to the music of Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll. Born in Tupelo, Mississippi, Elvis spent his teenage years in Memphis, Tennessee, where he began to pursue a career in music. His earliest recordings failed to impress, and Elvis started working as a truck driver. He then met Sam Phillips, owner of Sun Records. Phillips had been on the lookout for white musicians that might bring the African-American sounds of rhythm and blues to both white and black audiences. In Elvis's That's All Right Mama from 1954, Phillips found the sound he was looking for. This recording is in the style of a live recording and features the electric bass playing of Bill Black and the guitar playing of Scotty Moore in Elvis. Phillips recorded onto 2 tapes, and the sound on the second tape was slightly delayed, creating an echo, or what Sam Phillips called the slap-back effect. Although this single didn't sell enough to chart nationally, it was very popular around Memphis. History has judged it as one of the first, if not the first, rock and roll singles to be released. After touring the Southeast and appearing multiple times on the Louisiana Hayride Show, which was Shreveport's rival to Nashville's Grand Ole Opry, Elvis's contract was sold to the much larger label RCA for an unprecedented amount. It was sold for around $40,000. With a much larger publicity machine behind him, Elvis would become a national and even international musical icon. After a short stint in the military in Germany, where he met his future wife Priscilla, Elvis returned to the United States and expanded his presence on the silver screen. After several comeback attempts, he ended up a sorry caricature of his earlier self, an overweight drug addict. He spent much of his time at the stage of his life at his Graceland estate outside of Memphis. Although the most popular musician of early rock and roll, Elvis was far from its only important representative. Born in 1926, Chuck Berry traveled north to Chicago, where he signed with Chess Records, who started recording the new rock and roll, much to the eventual chagrin of blues musician Muddy Waters. Waters, if I remember correctly, had actually introduced Berry to Leonard Chess. Chuck Berry quickly became known for his clever lyrics and for his duck walk, a still of which can be seen on your screen. His Johnny Be Good is about a country boy who plays guitar and aspires to seeing his name in lights. It uses a 12-bar blues for its verses and chorus. The chorus is actually a contrasting melodic line for the words go Johnny go, go, go Johnny go Johnny be good. This song was a hit with both white and black audiences. It hit number 2 on the Billboard R&B chart and number 8 on the Billboard Hot 100 chart. Two very fine pianists who achieved rock and roll fame are Little Richard and Jerry Lee Lewis. Both achieved fame rather quickly, partly because of their performance antics. You can see in the photos on your screen, Little Richard often played the piano with both his arms and his legs, and Jerry Lee Lewis was known to stand on top of a piano and sing at times. Make sure to listen to Tutti Frutti and Great Balls of Fire on your YouTube playlist. Do listen to more examples of early rock and roll by musicians such as Bill Haley and the Comets, Buddy Holly and the Crickets, the Everly Brothers, and Roy Orbison on your playlist. As Don McLean exclaimed in his famous 1971 song, American Pie, the cold day in February of 1959 on which Buddy Holly died in a plane crash has often been seen as, quote, the day that music died, end quote. It is clear that popular music changed in striking ways at the end of the 1950s. There were a number of elements in play. First, by the end of the 1950s, most of the popular musicians of the 50s were no longer front and center in the public consciousness. Little Richard had found God, quit music, and entered the ministry. Elvis had entered the military. Chuck Berry and Jerry Lee Lewis were both imprisoned for their relationships with underage women. And, as just mentioned, Buddy Holly was killed in a tragic plane accident. A second element that led to a profound shift in popular music around 1959 was the prosecution of those who had been involved in payola. Payola is the practice of paying disc jockeys to play your label's recordings, and this was a vital element of marketing a musician or a group of musicians in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. It was also determined to be illegal, and in the late 1959, a congressional committee was launched to investigate abuses of the law. Two of the most famous DJs to get wrapped up in the affair were Alan Freed and Dick Clark. The career of Alan Freed, who was a popular and influential DJ on the East Coast, was effectively ruined by the scandal. He refused to cooperate and insisted that he was not guilty. Dick Clark, on the other hand, who would go on to host a very important TV show called American Bandstand, and who just passed away a year ago, worked with the committee and paid some fines, and this enabled him to continue working. He would eventually be known as America's oldest teenager, based on his working up into his 80s and his youthful appearance. A third element that contributed to this musical sea change was the rise of the producer, and we'll discuss that more fully in a later lecture. For now, here is a slide of review questions. This ends the video on early rock and roll. I'll reveal the answers after a short pause. Okay, so hopefully you've had a chance to pause your video and ponder and look back and review so that you have been able to answer these questions. The first question is about payola. This scandal ended up implicating Alan Freed, and Dick Clark. The second question is about the slapback effect or the slapback echo. This was something that Sam Phillips did with a small Memphis recording label, Sun Records, and so you hear a lot of this on early Elvis recordings. And there's a final question about who was important to early rock and roll. And the only person on that list that was not really important to early rock and roll was Mick Jagger. Mick Jagger, of course, would come along in the 60s and be very important to rock, but not to early rock and roll.